I don't see any questions, but if you think of any, feel free to add them in the chat and I can follow up with you one-on-one. And we will go ahead and get started. Today is a lecture, so please make sure that you have a piece of paper, well, multiple pieces of paper and a writing utensil available so you can take notes. Please chat a 100 when you are ready for notes. Again, chat a 100 when you are ready for notes. Thank you, Giovanni. Thank you so much for the urgency. Thank you, Kayla. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Dwayne. Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. Please make sure you are taking notes. This is the last new content lecture you will have for APUSH. All of the lectures you will have for the rest of the next 2 weeks will be reviewed. So today we are going to be looking at temporary America from 1982 in the election of Bill Clinton to the present. And we're going to start with the Clinton administration. President George H.W. Bush was a Republican, as we remember from last week, and he was going to look for a second term. However, the United States was ready for a change and decided to elect Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton into the presidency. So again, Bill Clinton is a Democrat. He is the governor from Arkansas, and he wins the election of 1992. Clinton tried to follow a middle road in terms of the economy, which means he used both liberal and conservative economic policies. So again, in terms of economics, Clinton used both liberal and conservative policies. And so he proposed that the government cut spending while also increasing taxes. And neither of those things were well received by the public. Clinton also put a lot of work into his health campaign. He proposed a government-supervised health insurance program that would guarantee affordable coverage for every American. But ultimately, this was also not well received by the public. I mean, actually, sorry, this did not go forward in Congress, even though the public approved it. So again, Clinton's healthcare reform was not accepted by Congress, but it was well received by the public. Clinton also took a stand in terms of homosexuality in the military and developed the don't ask, don't tell policy. So again, Clinton creates this don't ask, don't tell policy, which means that as long as you remained closeted, you could stay in the military. We're now going to look at the 94 midterm election, which was super notable for a variety of reasons. For example, Republicans endorsed this idea of a contract with America. So again, Republican candidates are endorsing this idea of a contract with America. Which had 4 main pieces. So in this contract with America, they promised to 1, scale back the role of the federal government. 2, they would eliminate some regulations. 3, they would cut taxes. And 4, they would balance the budget. In 94, Republicans were able to win a majority in both the House and the Senate, which led to a lot of conflict between the legislative and executive branch. So again, legislative is Congress, executive is the president. So there's a lot of conflict between the House of Representatives and the Senate versus the president. In fact, it was so bad that the government experienced a short government closure. Now, a government closure is when Congress and the president cannot agree on a budget and refuse to pass it. And this greatly disrupted American life. But in August of 1996, Congress and Clinton agree on a sweeping reform of the nation's welfare system. And in this new welfare system, this gave more authority to the states. It eliminated some federal guarantees of cash assistance. And it also placed a limit on the length of time that Americans could receive welfare. So again, in this new welfare system, it gives more authority to states. It eliminates federal guarantees of assistance. And it places a limit on the length of time that Americans can receive welfare. Now we're going to look into his second term. Clinton wins re-election in 1996. And in Clinton's second term, the economy greatly improves. However, there are a couple moments of scandal in this second term. The first scandal that Clinton was caught in was the Whitewater scandal. And during the Whitewater scandal, Clinton was accused of having taken part in fraudulent loans and land deals in Arkansas. So again, in Whitewater, Clinton was accused of having taken part in fraudulent loans and land deals in Arkansas. So that was the first scandal. The second scandal came up when Clinton denied that he had a sexual relationship with White House intern Monica Lewinsky. And in December of 1998, the House votes to impeach Bill Clinton. Clinton is impeached on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. And when Clinton is ultimately acquitted, people still continue to question his character and judgment, and most of his second term is swallowed up by the impeachment scandal. Sorry, Kayla, I see your question. I'm just making sure. The scandals took place in 1998. Which takes us to the next president, George W. Bush. So the election of 2000 is the closest election since 1876 and is the first election to be decided by the Supreme Court. Democrat Al Gore got more than 500,000 more popular votes than Republican George W. Bush. But as we know, the president is determined by the Electoral College. Ultimately, it came down to Florida, where Bush led by just over 500 votes. Democrats asked for multiple recounts, which became a Supreme Court issue. But ultimately, the recounts stop and Gore accepts the decision, making Bush the 43rd president of the United States. During Bush's early years, he proposed a massive tax cut in 2001 and again in 2003. Both of these tax cuts were approved by Congress, but were heavily criticized by Democrats. Democrats worried that these tax cuts would greatly increase the national debt. And all of this is compounded by the dot-com bubble. The technology boom of the 90s burst in 2002, which led to a collapse of several large companies and ultimately put the United States into a recession. During the early years of the Bush administration, we also see an increase of this idea called globalization. Now, globalization refers to the development of global and regional economic organizations. So again, globalization is the development of global and regional economic organizations, which means that the world becomes more and more connected through money. As you'll see, there are several acronyms at the top of your slide. I'm going to tell you what all of those are and explain what those do. The first is the WTO, which stands for World Trade Organization. Secondly, you have the International Monetary Fund. And third, you have the World Bank. And all three of these establish international trade agreements. They enforced rules and gave loans to poorer nations. And through globalization, we see a growing gap between the richest and the poorest countries. This is considered to be one of the main factors in the growing acts of terrorism against the United States. So again, globalization and the separation between rich and poor countries is considered one of the causes of a growth in terrorism. Terrorist attacks grew greatly in the late 20th and early 21st century. And there were a series of terrorist attacks that occurred in the 1990s. But probably the most infamous is, in terms of global terrorism, 9/11. On September 11th, 2001, the coordinated attacks by Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda is spelled Al-Qaeda, so the coordinated attacks by Al-Qaeda resulted in commercial airlines hitting the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. Planes also hit the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. And there was a plane that crashed in Pennsylvania. And these attacks led to the deaths of nearly 3,000 Americans. These attacks empowered the Bush administration to take action, and ultimately the United States goes to war in Afghanistan with broad support from countries around the world. Domestically, Americans are also willing to accept tightened security through background checks and airport searches. We also have the Patriot X, passed in 2001 and 2003, which gave immense power to the United States government to obtain information and expand surveillance. And many Americans were troubled by the unlimited amounts of wiretaps and the collection of records from cell phone calls and emails. Which leads us to the war on terror in terms of foreign policy. As I said earlier, in response to the 9/11 attacks, President Bush launched an offensive war in Afghanistan. And while the American forces were able to remove the Taliban from power in Afghanistan, they were ultimately caught up in more local affairs. As a way to build security at home, the Bush administration creates the Department of Homeland Security. And the Department of Homeland Security combines more than 20 agencies and over 170,000 federal employees. The Bush administration also had a preemptive attack on Iraq and their leader, Saddam Hussein. And Bush justified this attack on Iraq that he wanted to prevent their development of weapons of mass destruction. Despite a lack of evidence for WMDs, the United States invades Iraq anyways, and we see a large growth in violence. And the United States is ultimately criticized at home and abroad for the invasion of Iraq. All of this leads us to the 2008 election. In the lead up to the 2008 election, the United States experiences a major housing crisis in 2007. So again, in 2007, there is a housing crisis that leads to the worst economic crisis in the United States since the Great Depression. And ultimately now we call this the Great Recession. And in the Great Recession, unemployment soars, the stock market crashed, and several large financial institutions collapse. Despite government responses, the crisis continues. And as the United States is facing an economic crisis at home and a foreign policy crisis in the Middle East, the United States seeks change once again. And in 2008, they elect Democrat Barack Obama, who is the nation's first African-American president. And the Democrats also take control of both houses of Congress. So you have a Democrat in the White House and you have Democrats controlling both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Now we're going to look briefly at the Obama years, and this is the last slide of the lecture as a heads up. So to help stimulate the economy, President Obama works with Congress to spend billions of dollars on construction projects, education spending, and investments into renewable energy. So again, to help stimulate the economy, Obama works with Congress to spend billions of dollars on new construction projects, education spending, and investments in renewable energy. Congress also passes regulations for financial institutions. Which means that they are making sure that they are protecting Americans from faulty investments. But probably the most signature legislation from Obama's administration is Obamacare. Obamacare is officially known as the Affordable Care Act. And this health insurance program offers health insurance to millions of Americans who do not have it. And it also increases regulation of private insurance companies. However, Obamacare is very, very unpopular with conservatives who develop a new party known as the Tea Party. And the Tea Party is upset at the government spending on healthcare and in 2010, they gain a lot of power in Congress and continue to push for conservative policies. And that is our lecture. Any questions on those slides? Okay, just as again, a reminder, on Friday from 8:30 to 12:30, we will have a practice APUSH exam here at the school. If you are unable to join in person, I can create a digital opportunity. However, I greatly encourage you to come into the school for that practice. That is going to be the best way for you to remember this type of endurance. If you have any questions about that, please let me know. I'll be posting an official announcement and sending direct communication to some of you about it. So let me know if you have any questions about that. In the multiple choice for today's exit ticket, please make sure you are reading question 3 carefully. Make sure you read, or I guess it's question 2. The second multiple choice question, make sure you're reading that carefully. You guys can go ahead and transition to the exit ticket. Once I see a response to the exit ticket and a submission on Google Classroom, you guys are free to go. And make sure you are turning in your notes on Google Classroom. And then once you do that, you are free to go. So make sure you're turning in the exit ticket and pictures of your notes on Google Classroom. Thank you, Mahmoud and Samaj. I have your guys' exit tickets. Just make sure you post on Google Classroom, and then you're good to go.